Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear friends of the MCI, dear partners of this distinguished guest online live talk of MCI, the Entrepreneurial School, I'm happy to welcome you to this event. Now, what is this event about? It is on the US-China competition, actually a very, very relevant and also actual and recent topic, and I'm more than pleased to welcome an expert who we couldn't have a better expert. And he's not just an expert, he's also a dear and long-standing friend of our university. Let me express my gratitude and a welcome for being here. Let me welcome Mr. Brad Glosserman. Brad Glosserman is Deputy Director and Visiting Professor at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University, now also sitting in Tokyo. Is that correct?
Indeed it is. It's nowhere near as nice as being in Innsbruck, but it'll have to do.
Thanks for sharing your time. I think it's quite late in Tokyo now. How late is it, Brad?
Oh, my watch says it's 1:02 in the morning.
Oh, poor you. So we owe you really. We are in deep debt. And you hold your Innsbruck Christmas cup. And Brad Glosserman has been teaching at the MCI for a number of years, not just for a number of years, for more than a decade. And you are also a senior advisor at the Pacific Forum in Honolulu, where you served as the executive director for 13 years. And MCI lecturer and lecturer at different universities all over the world. So once again, welcome and having a true expert in our live talk. Now, the live talk is about the US-China competition. And perhaps let me introduce this little event by with a couple of words. The US-China relationship is, according to Kurt Campbell, director of the Indo-Pacific policy in the Biden administration, now dominated by competition. That is worrisome, given the two countries' military capabilities and the potential for a downward spiral into confrontation and conflict. It perhaps is even more troubling since those two countries, possessors of the two largest global economies, must cooperate if there is to be any hope of resolution of the world's most pressing problems. Brad Glosserman will explore US views of this relationship and the potential impacts of a robust competition between the United States and China for those two countries, but also for Europe. So thank you very much for being here. Now let me also welcome and address some words to the audience. There is the opportunity to bring in questions after the little intro note delivered by Brad Glosserman. which will take roughly 15 minutes, and then there will be the opportunity to bring in questions. And the way to bring in question is just to send me an email, and the email address is livetalk@mci.edu. I'll repeat, livetalk@mci.edu. Thank you so much, Brett. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. I'd say it's a delight to be here, but I'm here. It would be much more of a delight to be in Innsbruck. I very much miss being there for the week, to see my friends and to have the opportunity, if nothing else, to breathe the air and just enjoy the city. I want to provide to you a U.S. perspective on the competition. I know you had a Chinese speaker a few days ago. I will try to be fair, but I think I have to acknowledge my biases. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, which means that I'll make about 10 points, I think, and they may be a little short and a little bit cryptic, but I look for our conversation to tease out the issues that are of more interest to your audience and perhaps a little more clarity and a little more depth in the points that I'm going to make. So first, as you noted, Kurt Campbell, who is the Indo-Pacific czar in the White House, says that today engagement is not describing what we're doing, but the dominant paradigm is competition. And this, secondly, is a process that has been underway for some time. I would say it began, a trend that began at the end of the Obama administration in 2014, calcified, took real shape in the Trump administration and continues to this day. It's one of the few issues in a very, very divided Washington, D.C., where both left and right, Democrats and Republicans, can agree. And so I think in the conversations that I've had, for example, with Chinese friends in the last couple of months and years, a belief perhaps that a Biden administration would have softened the U.S. approach, or that maybe some shift was coming, was a misguided or a mistaken belief. So I would anticipate that the trajectory of the relationship that we're currently experiencing is going to continue. That said, the bumper sticker is in fact the third point, which is while we will cooperate when we can, we will compete when we should, and we will confront when we must. And it's important to realize that there are all three dimensions of this relationship. And while in fact that there is this idea that we should be working together and that there are global problems that demand our cooperation, the reality is that we look at the world through very different lenses, and that is going to very much shape and influence the way we interact. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that there are going to be issues for which there will be very little scope for compromise and the potential for an actual confrontation in one form or another, not necessarily a physical clash, but is very, very real. Fourth, this, I think is important to note, is not a new Cold War. It's a very easy and facile analogy to draw, but it isn't inaccurate. In fact, this is a much more complex and much more difficult sort of standoff than the Cold War was. You know, that was primarily a military competition. The truth is the Soviet Union was a unidimensional power. Today we're looking, and I think the chief form of this, you know, this is going to be a competition across an entire range of forms of human behavior and state actions. And it's primarily going to be an economic competition. And so we've seen, for example, for the first time, the rise of a real center of economic gravity in Beijing with the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and most importantly, the Belton Road Initiative, sometimes called the One Belt, One Road, OBOR Initiative, which is designed to fill a multi-trillion-dollar investment gap. And I think that, you know, there's an inclination on the part of the West to look at this in some ways as some sort of attempt to buy or lease friends in the developed parts of the world. But the truth is, it is a very real need that needs to be felt. And that as this process of building and engagement continues, the Chinese are creating connections, they're setting standards, they're installing technologies, they're forging connections that are much, much more than merely economic exchange. And they're going to build in, if you will, relationships that are going to be with us for years to come, generations to come. And that's what's, I think, so really important to recognize about the nature of the economic competition, and in particular, in this sense, in this world in which we're trying to engage in, if you will, competitive development strategies. Fifth, The United States response to BRI and U.S. response has particularly been anemic, I think. But even in the West more generally, we haven't been able to, I think, muster a particularly powerful effort. We're trying it with the Build Back Better World initiative that was launched at the G7 and has been adopted by the OECD. But the truth of the matter is, in so many different ways, when the U.S. has pushed its allies and friends and other nations to turn back the Chinese, and for example, in 5G technologies, as I like to say, just say no isn't a response. You don't beat something with nothing. What's really important is that the West is going to have to put things on the table to address the very real needs that China is managing to fill with its BRI. And I mean, the United States is not isolationist. It is, the surveys show that we are still looking to engage the world, and we are prepared, in fact, to compromise with our allies as we do so. But there's another sticky problem, and that is that there has been a recognition that foreign policy in the U.S. has not served the middle class very well. And one of the things that we've got to do, as has been very evident in domestic politics in the United States, is focus on rebuilding the United States, rebuilding our own infrastructure, and rebuilding, meeting the needs of a middle class that is increasingly hollowed out and questioning our social contract. And the problem is there's only a limited amount of money. And so there's going to be a competition between the monies that we would choose to spend in the developed world and or the developing world and the monies that we would choose to spend at home. And striking that balance is going to be increasingly difficult. I think the previous administration went way too far in terms of its thinking about it, besides being very mistaken in its economic strategy. But I think we've gone way too far in the way that we chose to engage economically. We're swinging back, but we're not going to go to the point of generosity. We just don't have the excess funds and the capital that China has. So there's going to be an interesting competition there. Sixth point, the key in, I think, the future competition is going to be that over technology and the frontiers of new technologies. And I don't think we genuinely appreciate the way that digital societies and the digital economies and the digital technologies create entirely new forms of economic interaction and different sorts of returns. There is, the network effects. There is the winner take all follows. It is I think, in some ways, a much more zero-sum approach. And thus, I think there are profound implications for this competition for mastery of the frontiers, for who will be, whose technology will be adopted, who will be setting the standards. And as that goes forward, the cyclical nature of the funds that are returned to the companies and the countries that have mastered and then control those particular heights of new technologies. 7, it's important to recognize that as this competition unfolds, that the U.S. goal is, and I think importantly, is not to change China. And indulge me for a moment with a somewhat extensive comment from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, last weekend, because I think it lays out the administration's thinking. And I think that there are some parts of this that are obvious and parts that aren't. Jake said, the goal of U.S.-China policy is to create a circumstance in which two major powers are going to have to operate in an international system. We want the terms of that kind of coexistence to be favorable to American interests and values, to be set up so that the rules of the road reflect an open, fair, free Indo-Pacific region, an open, fair, free international economic system, and where basic values and norms that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are respected in international institutions. So we're looking for a particular value set, and we're looking for peaceful coexistence. He went on to say, one of the errors of previous approaches in policy toward China has been a view that U.S. policy would bring about a fundamental transformation of the Chinese system that is not the object of the Biden administration. The object is to shape the international environment so that it is more favorable to the interests and values of the United States and allies and partners to like-minded democracies. It is not to bring about some fundamental transformation in China itself. So I think this delimitation here, what the U.S. seeks to achieve, is extremely important. But equally important is this notion that if we are seeking to change and create a world in a certain way, it means that our competition is going to proceed in a manner that very much bounds what China is capable of doing. And by this, to me, this is one of the most important elements of this new competition. We have until recently believed, we in the West, that when it was a free and fair playing field in which all companies and countries would compete and the best would prevail. My sense now is what is implied in Jake's comments and what it seems to be is U.S. policy. The nature of the competition is to somehow ensure that the West maintains a 5 or 10-year lead in front of China. It is not about competing. It is about ensuring, in fact, that China cannot compete effectively. And so that dimension of this is new. And that is one I think that very few people understand. And the implications of that for who we are. I mean, it is a radical shifting of our approach to international engagement, and it has implications as well for the way we organize our societies and for the way our businesses operate. And that should be unbundled in the Q&A, but I think it's really, really important. Now, this has, in my next point, number 8, I think the only way that has a system, has a possibility of working is if the West aligns itself together, if there is an agreement and a concordance of thinking. And we're seeing that begin to emerge, for example, in the Trade and Technology Council that was just launched a few weeks ago in Pittsburgh between the United States and Europe. We've seen it in terms of the development of the new technologies in the quadrilateral security dialogue. We've seen it in the Australia, US, UK, US new enhanced security partnership that's focusing on these technologies as well. In every US bilateral and alliance meeting, we're discussing these issues. We're trying to identify these technologies and figuring out ways not only to control them, but to restrict access and ensure that as they are developed more effectively, that it is the US like-minded nations that are going to be dominating these new technologies. And quite frankly, we're trying to deny them to of the competition, whether it is China or any other countries with whom we feel as though we have a potentially competitive relationship. That said, and I think that what you're going to be looking for is ultimately, while the US insists and continues to insist that it is not trying to draw lines in the sand and divide the world into these blocks, my sense is that increasingly access to these technologies is going to depend upon taking a stand. And consequently, I think you're going to be seen as, that there are going to be hardening divisions. And if not spheres of influence, certainly we're going to see the articulation of certain digital spheres, technological spheres, in which there is not the free flow of these technologies and this intellectual property from one side to another. 2 final points, and they'll be very brief. Number 9, as I look at this world order, and by the way, while the United States is very clear about this, it is important to acknowledge that there are similar tendencies at work in China as well. The dual circulation strategy that's been articulated by the Chinese government, the promotion of national industrial capacity, whether it's the Made in China 2025 or any of the other plans, are promoting similar sort of national policies. And you're seeing a similar kind of rise of walls, if you will, equally high walls that prevent penetration or to prevent the exfiltration of technologies. And so to put the blame all on one side, I think, is a mistake. But, and this is the point I want to hammer, is I'm very concerned that in my engagement with my Chinese friends over the last month and year and so, I've discovered that this is a very frustrating conversation, because while there are problems in our relationship, it seems as though the position I'm hearing from my Chinese comrades and associates is that all of the problems are on the fault of the United States, and that the only way this relationship moves forward is if the US makes all the adjustments, and that's just not going to happen. And the inability to recognize that both sides have to compromise is going to be potentially fatal if we're not going to, it's not going to allow us to move forward. There has got to be give and take on both sides. And it clearly, it's required, and I'm just not seeing the requisite flexibility on that side. Final point, while this is going to be, I think, an economic and diplomatic, some degree ideological and technological competition, it has the potential to become kinetic. And one of the issues that is extremely troubling in recent years in recent weeks and months has been Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits and the increasing tension. And while I do not believe anyone is looking for a confrontation, and no one certainly wants to see it devolve or escalate into an actual physical conflict, the truth is there are lots of boats and lots of planes and lots of submarines in a very restricted space. and the potential for them to bump, for accidents to happen, is very real and getting higher all the time. So I think the dangers are of miscalculation and misperception and just mistakes. And unfortunately, we're not seeing, quite frankly, the crisis management mechanisms that there aren't enough of them out there, and the ones that exist are not functioning very well. There's a sadly tendency for us to set up crisis hotlines and then discover that in a crisis no one picks up the phone. That is no recipe for success. And that's 15 minutes, and I will stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett Glosserman, for your great insight. I've been marking down some questions, and I see already questions coming in. Perhaps I may raise first questions from my side. And going through what you've been saying, Brad. The one is now the approach of the U.S. administration. You mentioned the succession from Obama to Trump administration, and then over to the present Biden administration. Do you see a real change in the approach towards China through the different administrations, or is it more a matter of how the communications has been going differently, but is the approach per se, especially between Trump and Biden, towards China, is it really different? And where would you see the difference?
No, the brief answer to your question is from Trump to Biden, no. I think, the hardening began in the Obama years. And I think that what happened was that we forget that Xi Jinping only took office in 2011 and 2012. He acceded to the top position. And I think there were, if we all recall, I hope, questions about who Xi was and what his goals were going to be and what he was hoping to do. And I think and there was thus, for example, the original airing of an idea of a new new type of great power relations. And it wasn't clear what that meant. And I think I was told at the time that because it came from Xi himself, the US had to consider it. And then I think they decided that ultimately this was not going to be a productive framework. And as they watched development of policy and foreign policy, the island building campaign in the South China Sea, increasingly coercive behavior in its engagement with other countries, some questions about its behavior towards Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang. It became clear the nature of what the Xi government was going to do, and so I think the trajectory was set. Trump then elevated it, and I think framed it a particular way in his unique style, both in terms of outlook and literally personal diplomacy. But the framework that acknowledged that we had moved to a world of competition on a variety of issues, not only military but economic and diplomatic, that we faced the rise of a new near-peer competitor, and that we had to rethink the foundational tenets of global organization, global order. That I think has continued, and so as a result, you have not seen the rollback, for example, of the sanctions that Trump has imposed. You have not seen Campbell's comments about competition being the dominant mode. The only change we've really seen is that the 2017 national security strategy that Trump had wrote called an era of great power competition. And apparently in the last couple of weeks, the Biden administration has just said that we're going to refer to it as strategic competition rather than great power. So no, there has been not even a rhetorical shift, but the difference again is in many cases in the recent meetings that the Chinese have come forward and demanded that the U.S. shift its position, and the U.S. position has been that we're not prepared to do that, and so it is precisely that sort of hard edge which is pushing us even further in that direction. Sorry, long-winded answer.
And another question now, actually more related to the U.S., but obviously with also touching the U.S.-China competition. Now, you've mentioned that there is a new approach within the U.S. that it needs to be ahead in certain fields of technology for 5 to 10 years. And that this, according to your perception, is a new approach. But hasn't this always been an approach that in strategic technological fields there is a necessity, or it is seen as a necessity to be ahead of the others?
Yes and no, and this is the tricky bit. This is actually the subject of my new book, and and this is what's fascinating because, yes, we have traditionally looked at certain technologies. I mean, our systems for technology controls throughout the Cold War were focused upon military applications, and mostly had to do with weapons of mass destruction. But even the spillover and the Wassenaar agreements and perhaps other export controls, we were worried about anything that had a military application. But today, however, I think the issue, I mean, there's about three little pieces of this, but the issue is that today, the competition isn't purely military. It's just sort of who is going to be the mastery of these technologies has broad-based social and economic implications. And so you can lead, the companies and countries that master AI, biotechnologies, robotics, energy, etc. Those countries are going to be leading regardless of their military capabilities. And so what we've reached now is a sense where strategic was formerly just restricted to this military thing. Now strategic is this broad economic capacity and impact. And we now therefore are restricting these technologies that have far, far greater scope and are not merely military. In addition, mind you, we don't know what necessarily is going to be a strategic. Let me give you my favorite example. The United States has tried to identify emerging and foundational technologies, and it's come up with a list of about 14 that are broad categories that it is going to try to figure out how to regulate them. A company like, for example, I don't know, Mercedes-Benz, it thinks of itself as an auto manufacturer. Except as Mercedes contemplates the future, what is it going to be working on? It's going to, it's driverless automobiles that require artificial intelligence, sensors. It's going to have GPS, precision timing systems. And each of these three items is on that controlled technology list. And so, clearly some applications of them are going to be accessible to all and some will not. But I don't think that Mercedes, unlike Toyota, has thought of itself now as a high-tech company that needs to really think about American strategic technology controls. And yet that is the world in which we're moving. And so I think that poses foundationally different questions for businesses and governments. And we don't understand how that's going to work. And that, to me, is what's so fascinating about what I call the new national security economy.
And it's also about setting standards. It's not just developing the technology, but by doing so, also setting the standard for the others so that the others need to follow. I think that's something you have also been putting emphasis on, right?
Absolutely. We think about it, for example, in the Belton road industry. We build these infrastructure projects, and what do? Well, we build, we're developing the connectivity that is not just the roads, but it's, the digital infrastructure that goes with all of that. And, whose technology goes in, and as we adapt that, whose standards, as you say, are going to be governing the use of these technologies. And then, of course, it's far, far easier to build on the next generation of a Huawei system, go from Huawei 3 to Huawei 4 to Huawei 5, than it is to plop an Ericsson system on top of that. So once you've established your tech as the standard and installed it physically, that pretty much gives you a real advantage on what's going on in the next couple of generations. And so, it's just talk of winner take all sort of systems, but there is a far greater path determinacy to these developments than what I think most people appreciate, and certainly has been the case in a brick and mortar and analog world. Digital changes all of that.
Now, looking on my screen, I get quite a bad feeling to see all these multiple questions, which I have, which I hope to be able to bring them in. I'll start with the first one, and it's coming from, perhaps you remember the student. He is a former MCI student. Coming from Hawaii, and his name is Craig Ursay. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you remember him. And he has sent me two questions, one on Japan and one on China. I'll take the one on China. and I'll read it now. China is investing billions of dollars in infrastructure projects in developing nations around the world. It owns Greece's ports and is expanding its foreign direct investments with the power of its state-owned enterprises. Their soft power is starting to build a coalition of votes at the United Nations. Meanwhile, the US has strict foreign aid policies towards corrupt nations and does not run state-owned enterprises. Now this is the question, what could the US be doing differently today to counter China's aggressive soft power with developing nations?
Well, I think there's first, let's take as given his premises, but there's some challenges there. I mean, Chinese companies are providing money, but some of their presence, you're finding, has got some owners that that reporting is unclear. The studies are go back and forth as to exactly how heavy the debt burden may be. In some cases, when the Chinese are sending their investments in, they're sending Chinese companies and Chinese labor. So the issue of soft power is subject to dispute. But I think without question, the Chinese are making friends insofar as they provide the capital that builds, as I said before, you don't beat something with nothing. So what does the US do? Well, I think what the US does is quite simply, it allies with its other like-minded partners in the region, in the world, to try to fill these needs as well, and try to provide, the tools that, number one, to provide with money. And we do this with the Japanese, with the Australians, with the EU and with the UK, formerly part of the EU, to work together in areas of interest where we see, in the South Pacific, we work with France, and elsewhere in nearby, we might work with Australia or New Zealand. The Japanese are providing funds as well. So we need to conceptualize this as a broader coalition of forces, number one. Number two, I think we need to be smart about how we provide funds. So if we can't necessarily just offer them the money to build the bridge or the road, what we can perhaps do is a sort of more long-term project, which is that we provide the tools that give these countries the ability to better evaluate the offers that are being made. In some cases, what ends up happening is that you just do not have the legal or technical or administrative infrastructure that allows you to understand really well the terms of the deals you're entering. So one of the things the U.S. can be doing is better equipping these nations to address these problems and be better able to deal with the offer and better able to assess the options the offers that are being made.
A very interesting topic, especially, there is certain countries being vulnerable to corruption. And I'm not sure whether you can reach them with the approach you have been mentioning. Providing them with the knowledge and the technology to evaluate the potential investment, if it's for their own personal sake and for their personal pocket, the investment. That may be then a different story, huh?
It's true. I think at some point we have to be trying to push transparency and accountability and rule of law. And so we do this by pushing our standards through, when we're working with other countries, when we work with institutions, regional institutions, the Asian Development Bank, other places where we can, or even in the terms of trade agreements like the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We try to be pressing these standards to promote the transparency that at least, I think, undercuts the ill effects of some of these deals, and just does. We ultimately can't administer these projects ourselves, but we can hopefully, the best thing we can do is give countries the tools to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Brett. Now I have two questions coming in from the head of our China Center. The MCI has been establishing a China Center, and we have a very ambitious and productive head of this center called Professor Dr. Wei Monske Wang, and she has sent me two questions, actually, I think from next door's office. And the first question goes, the tech war from the US against Huawei, and the related case of Ms. Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the founder of Mr. Ren Zhengfei, has been released after about 1,000 days of house arrest without any guilty pleas. How did you observe this? How will it affect the relationship in your opinion?
She did not plead guilty, but she did make a proffer, and it is essentially an acknowledgement that the charges that have been leveled were in fact valid. And I forget the technical term. I used to be a lawyer in another life, and mercifully I've blocked that out of my frontal lobes. I think, first of all, the situation with Ms. Meng is that particular problem is over. But I think that the implications and ramifications of that for China are negative and are going to continue. I think there's been extraordinary ill will that has been generated in Canada, as in other countries where China has done its best to neutralize what it considers to be negative behaviors. And I think that there is a concern that similar cases might emerge. In other words, the issue for the Canadians was not the fact that Ms. Meng was held, that she was held, according to the legal commitments that Canada had with the United States. The problem for Canadians was that 2 Canadian citizens were seized on pretexts, put in very hostile and very unforgiving prisons, and were released almost immediately upon her release in ways that pretty much validated concerns that they had been taken hostage as collateral damage. And it has worried, quite frankly, a number of business people that they too might ultimately find themselves in a similar situation. And I think that perception, negative perception, will continue for a while. The war against Huawei will continue as well. The fact is that the United States has very serious doubts about the security of Huawei systems, and is not prepared to do business with it, nor is it comfortable exchanging intelligence and information with countries that have it, with Huawei in its telecommunications backbones and networks. I will be honest and say the reasons that the Americans are so upset about Huawei is because Huawei is able to do what the Americans have always done to other countries. I mean, we are not blameless in all of this, without question. I mean, we need to acknowledge that. But nevertheless, that's the position that the U.S. government has taken, that there are vulnerabilities that are in Huawei systems, and the concerns about those vulnerabilities will continue.
We'll bring in a second question, going into a different direction, coming also from Professor Monskeva. She totally agrees that the US and China shall work together. It would be good for the world. But she asks now, what is your advice for the future relationship between the US and China? What's the advice? Yeah.
I think the advice is that they've got to identify the areas where that common interests are sufficiently powerful, and that alone is a reason to proceed. So, for example, working on climate change issues, working in the field that I work on, trying to figure out ways to push the North Koreans back into negotiations over their nuclear weapons, figuring out ways to set rules of the road for trade, or for even for trade that are going to benefit as many countries as possible, and to establish crisis management mechanisms. I have to tell you, to me, all of those things are worth pursuing for their own merit. But my sense is that literally in conversations I had with Chinese experts and officials in the last week, the reply is that we are not prepared to do that at the end of a gun. That we feel as though we are not prepared to work and cooperate with the United States when the U.S. is threatening our other interests, and that there is quite simply a linkage of things that are important to China, these concerns, with other issues. And I fail to understand why China should look for the United States to change its behavior before China will work on an issue that is manifestly by itself in China's own interest to address.
Thank you very much, Brad. Now I have two questions which were brought in by a dear friend of the MCI also, Professor Jürgen Huber. He is a professor of corporate finance at the University of Innsbruck, of our alma mater. And the first question is, recently there was a tech clash in China as Xi Jinping humbled tech companies like Alibaba, Ant, and Didi. Will this hurt Chinese growth in the long term? And in addition, he argues, I think it will, but some argue that China does regulate big tech in a way that the US and the EU fail to do with Google, Amazon, and Facebook. How would you see that?
An interesting question. The moves against big tech were, in my sense, an attempt to eliminate potential power sources that had the potential to threaten the Chinese Communist Party leadership. There were some technical and financial questions that were associated with those regulatory issues. But mostly, I think that it was driven by a concern that you would have developed alternative potential sources of power, and that these organizations and these individuals had gotten too big for their britches, if you will.
Okay.
But so at the same time, I think, yes, there are some concerns about regulatory structures. Data localization is an issue that's going to be of real concern. In the Chinese, for example, the Didi IPO, which was kind of scuppered at the last moment because it was ultimately a problem that had to deal with security of data. And I think, again, those are fair and legitimate concerns. The problem that China will be facing soon, and I've actually encountered it with some conversations that I've had with younger entrepreneurs, is that there are doubts about the degree to which where the Chinese Communist Party is going to draw the line. By that I mean that there is a concern that young entrepreneurs and innovators are going to feel as though that the fruits of their labor may not belong to them. Because if they are successful in certain areas, if they're too successful, that the government will step in and tell them that's enough, that's no longer, for whatever reason we do not approve, and we're going to throttle you and scale you back. And that will throttle innovation as well. So I think that has the real risk to slow the economy down. But in a country of 1.3 billion people with a population that size, you may lose the best and the brightest, but you'll still have enough people, a lot of folks in there to keep moving things forward. You just may lose, if you will, the real brightest stars because of a fear that they will never be properly rewarded for their own labor.
So it was, according to your perception, it was more a political power play than an economic regulatory aim.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Another question by Jürgen Huber. I said he was professor of corporate finance. Now he has more shifted into the field of empirical finance to give you an idea about his background. And the second question goes into a different field, and he asks, arguably the three most likely triggers of a hot war between China and US are A, Taiwan, B, the South China Sea, or a collapse of North Korea. That would be C. How would you see these risks, and do you expect a hot war within the next 20 years?
Good questions. I mean, I think he's identified the risks quite well. I don't think, I think Taiwan becomes a problem through miscalculation and misperception. The South China Sea becomes a problem through a mistake. Something goes bump. It's very difficult to see. There's a lot of territory in the South China Sea, and it's difficult to see the stakes as being sufficiently high. I mean, it would have to be a real chain of catastrophically bad decisions and bad luck that manifests in a kinetic exchange there. Taiwan, that's sadly much too easy. North Korea, I can see North Korea making miscalculations that draw it into a war. I'm not sure where it triggers some sort of conflict. The degree to which the Chinese get involved in that is, I think, that seems very low, the lowest of the three. So the chance of a war on the Korean Peninsula is not the lowest, but the chance of a Chinese involvement in that war is, I think, relatively low. 20 years, Taiwan is possible, but again, by mistake, not by design.
Mhm. Now let's look to Europe. Give a glance on Europe. And the question came in from Alex Pasiak. He is a strategy consultant in the region. And he asks, now from your US perspective, Brad, what could Europe potentially offer as a role model for a next generation global future that US and China cannot? And how to get there? I hope you don't say nothing.
No. There was a time in which I would have. The hard power contributions that Europe can make to this part of the world are limited. I mean, when I have these conversations with my European friends, the most important thing, as somebody who's worked a lot on defense and security issues, the most important thing that Europe can do is spend enough, get its defense budgets up and do more in Europe so that it frees up resources for the United States to deploy in this part of the world. A German frigate every 2 years, a small UK ship, French aircraft carrier every couple of years isn't going to make a big difference. It's not going to, in a crisis, I don't think they're going to make a substantial contribution. Sorry. I think what Europe can do is gird the principles of the liberal international order. I mean, Europe's real superpower is soft power. Its ability to support ideals of democracy, of human rights. And what it needs to do is fervently defend those. Southeast Asian or Asian countries are not as happy to talk about values. And there are other countries that will talk about values, but in the crunch here will not push them because precisely of a fear of antagonizing some of the other countries that would prefer to be realists rather than liberal internationalists. So I think what Europe needs to really do is make sure that it remains a beacon for liberal democracy, that it remains a beacon for openness, for the sort of standards that we want to be seeing propagated throughout the rest of the world, to try to promote, as you said, transparency, to promote sustainable development, to be a good international citizen, to set that standard and try not only to live up to it, but to also try to press it, in a responsible diplomatic manner on the rest of the world. We in the United States, sadly, tend to we slip a lot, and we tend to fall back on other. So set a good example for the rest of us.
But Brad, may I personally come in here with a small, perhaps doubt? Yeah, actually, from the European side, we see it that way, that our values are so well perceived. Yeah, liberalism, democracy, freedom of speech, transparency, all that, name it. Yeah. But are they really seen as positive in other parts of the world? Are they seen as being exemplary? Perhaps I think they generally are, but at the same side, at the same time, they may be seen as they create softness and vulnerability. Yeah. So how would you see that?
I think that we have to believe in our ideals, and we have to try to promote them, and we have to believe that they are as good as we think they are. And the way that we do that is to demonstrate their strength, and that this notion that somehow or other we are not in fact weaker because we are, we may appear softer, but that doesn't make us weaker. This is a particularly difficult and thorny question when it comes to open societies and information. We're far more resistant, far more susceptible to being manipulated and being moved by disinformation. But for us to retreat and for us to close off our information sphere and become far more controlling in how we look at information, then all we've done is legitimate the tyrants and the autocrats. So we figure, and I don't have that's, mind you, that's pablum I just threw at you. I mean, that's easy rhetoric. there has to be the practical applications of those principles. And it's quite difficult because we do need to protect ourselves and figure out ways to insulate ourselves from some of this damage. But we need to believe in our values, and we need to be prepared to defend them, and we need to be prepared to demonstrate how they're superior. And it's tough. It's very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Now, a question from Professor Thomas Osberg. He's a part-time faculty member at the MCI, and he is professor at the university in Germany, and he was working before in the industries, I think, with Intel. Now, he has sent me a question. Should company strategies with regards to China be aligned across industry sectors? For instance, to give the US or Europe more negotiation power? Or should some sectors compete, others partner, and others follow?
Well, I think it's going to depend on the sector, obviously. I mean, in the sense that, we're going to decide, this goes back to those strategic technologies. So we're going to decide that there's some technologies and some sectors for which we need to be very careful about who gets access to them. But that's not across the board. And the problem is we don't know what those technologies are, and we don't know what has them. There needs to be, I think, better cooperation among industry and better cooperation between business and industry to understand the landscape of those particular industries and to better, to grasp, if you will, the macro environment in which decision-making is being done. And I would hope that we can have those exchanges of information without stepping over or, immediately moving into monopolistic or behaviors. So, there are ways in which we can certainly better understand the marketplace and ensure that the technologies that we are capable of competing. But I think, one of the problems that we also face is that we have relatively impoverished models for of government business cooperation. And we really, I think, we tend to look at this as either it's, the very, very extreme version of Anglo-Saxon individualism and crazy, companies completely free of the government, of which is a complete and total myth of the American economic history, or you have the model of socialism, and you Europeans, of course, are just terrible socialists. And all of those are myths. We need to figure out sort of a better understanding of that ties, if you will, some of the cooperative socio-political economic structures that has evolved in Germany, I think, is a very good example, but tie them as well to, the emerging technologies. And we don't have a good lay of the land and to what that consists of. And it's going to be a challenge, quite frankly, to put all that together. Sorry, it's kind of long-winded and I'm afraid unfocused answer.
No, all good. Very, very impressed by your thoughtfulness.
There's one thing I think, and this is something that I've been working on, and I think it should come to the attention of your audience, is that we've been discussing in a lot of the literature a hybrid form of capitalism that's emerging in China. And it's not merely the activities of state-owned enterprises, but the deeper penetration, even within the private sector, of companies with the Chinese Communist Party. There's a requirement to have cells. You have direction in terms of the availability of funds. You see far, far greater integration of the public and private, and in a hybrid model, of which some Chinese scholars in the U.S. called CCP Inc. The point is that what you're seeing is decision-making in boardrooms in Chinese companies that are driven, in some cases, by strategic concerns, not business concerns. And our model, both the people sitting across the table from these, or when they're engaged in business decisions and transactions, are not used to seeing that being the calculus on the other side of the table. And I think we need, if a company, apart from the advantage that certain companies enjoy by virtue of subsidies or what have you, that's an unfair competition. But it also just seems to me that when companies are buying things because of larger strategic assessments and not merely the profit from that particular deal, that there's a mismatch there that needs to be aligned. To say nothing of the fact that our trade institutions such as the WTO are just not prepared to deal with this new kind of hybrid entity. And so, there's a lot of speculation about the degree to which the evolving business practices in China are proving to be foundational challenges to the existing trade, regulatory, investment, trade, and business mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brad, very for the great insight. Now, Mahinder Kari, a dear friend of the MCI, now based in London, he is the longtime chairman and actually the founder of Kari Associates. He has sent me 5 questions. I may bring forward 2 or 3 of them, but they are quite short and I think concise. Now, the first question is: when is the Chinese economy likely to reach a plateau?
It could be tomorrow. It could be in 20 years. It could be I mean, it's certainly going to come under demographic constraints. Within, the word is China will be the first country to get old before it gets rich. So it's impossible to tell, but I would say it's not going to be for another 15 or 20 years at the very, very least.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Chinese workers still appear to be working somewhat as captives. Is this your observation as well?
Increasingly, no, that's not true. You're seeing real complaints and changes in labor law. You're seeing increasing wage rates such that the labor advantages of the existing Chinese companies in many ways is really, really falling off. You're seeing labor shortages. So I think there's you're not going to have unions as in the West, but no, there's more voice to Chinese labor.
Mm-hmm. Do women lack power and status in China, especially in the rural areas?
I think so. I don't know of any way in which women in China are different from women anywhere else. And I would note that my wife is Chinese. So.
Okay. So you're under pressure, right?
She's asleep in the other room, so I can speak freely.
Okay. Now, multinationals of China appear to be socialist and state-owned on paper, but capitalist in nature. True or false?
No, it's not. They're hybrids. I mean, in some ways, their behavior can be very capitalistic, and in other times, their behavior can be very much directed by the state. So, I mean, there is no single answer to that question. Sorry. Okay.
Now, a question from a dear friend of the MCI, and I think you know him as well, Michael Reiterer. He was a former ambassador of Europe, of the European Commission to Tokyo, and then later on to Seoul, and also to different places. Now, Michael has sent me and asked me to express his greetings. There is the need for cooperation, he says. Extend transatlantic cooperation to Indo-Pacific. Is the U.S. ready to do so? After Afghanistan, for instance, and AUKUS, good sign, a high-level group was set up. Biden does not pay attention to trade. Standard setting in RCEP and CPTPP. WTO needs to get back on track. Multilateralism also needed for cooperation in IP. ASEAN centrality not respected in Quad or AUKUS. Indeed, emerging technology is key. Europe behind in AI, need for cooperation. That is the comment of Michael. What would you say?
He's right on. I mean, yes, we need transatlantic cooperation because that's where so much of the leading edge technologies are. It would be great, it would be great to extend that to the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region as well. Originally, back in the Obama year, the idea was to set up TPP, and then you would have the TTIP, or I can't remember what it was called, the Atlantic, remember, the Trade and Investment Agreement. And because the WTO round had failed, we were going to have one Atlantic deal, one Pacific deal, and then link them together. And that fell apart, of course. His critique of Biden is correct. There is no real trade strategy. And our failure to engage, to join the CPTPP or rejoin TPP, whatever, is just criminal. But sadly, I don't anticipate a change in that. So one of the things I keep going back to is that we need in the United States to be working with like-minded countries in Europe, Japan, Australia, South Korea are really, really key partners. we're making some progress, right? The settling of the steel and aluminum tariffs, the settling of the aircraft subsidy issues, all of that is going to lead, ideally to diminish some of the obstacles and hopefully make it easier for us to work together. But we've got to articulate a view and a vision and agree on it, and then we've got to put some meat on the bones of that easy rhetoric.
Mm. Thanks, and Michael, also thanks from my side, and best regards from my side. He has summed it up with the title of his paper: "There is no Asia policy without a China policy, but the China policy is no Asia policy."
True.
Sure.
Absolutely
Okay.
true. There used to be said that you have two ways to build a relationship with Asia. You can build it with China and then put all the pieces out around it, or you can build the other pieces, the allies, the partners, and then you have, when all of that's done, you have a one piece left, and that's China. So it's either China out or partners and allies in, and I think we should be doing the latter. It really has to be about finding our common interests, and there's just united we stand, I guess is the easiest way to put it.
And by the way, I'm not sure whether you are aware of this. Michael Reiter has also contributed a lot to the MCI, and one element, one pillar of it, he has been able to bring in the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and in collaboration with his Vienna Center on global citizenship, the Ban Ki-moon Center, we have been establishing a Ban Ki-moon scholarship on and on the SDG. So this is something you should know, Brad, which may be also of interest to you. Thanks to Michael.
My lecture today, my students, I told them that I was talking about the Koreas, and I was telling them that Korea is always the overlooked country in Asia. Japan and China tend to get all the attention. Korea deserves and needs more attention, and it'd be a very rewarding study, so that's great to hear.
As we are running out of time, I may perhaps bring in one or two final questions, and one comes from Federico Zock. You will love him. He is a dear friend also of the MCI, and he is the owner of Wien Consult and Partners, wine brokers and consultants. So we get to, this is another argument for bringing you here to Innsbruck as soon as possible, dear Brad.
Absolutely.
And the question goes, which chances does the European Union have to survive technologically and economically seen in the competition or cooperation between the United States and China? Which chance does the European Union have to survive technologically and economically seen?
Of course, it's got a very good chance. I mean, you look at some of the leading edge technologies are coming from Europe, and equally important, the systems, right? That the industry of 4.0 that the Germans have put together has become really a model in many ways for the integration, if you will, of new technologies into society. The EU has been instrumental, vital in setting standards. The data protection law is the standard for all countries in the world. So I mean, I think the question, Europe needs confidence, and Europe needs to be looking to the future. And the trick is always in Europe is going to be wrestling its 26 different members together in moving them forward and finding that consensus that allows them to play the role that's up to them. And to be very honest, the Chinese are being very smart with the 17+1 dialogue, where they're trying to make inroads into the Union and trying to acquire the allies and spokespersons for them, such that I mean, to be very crude and to be very simple, and I'm sorry to go on, China is a huge country with great ambitions and increasingly less restrictions and constraints upon its behavior. No country is the size of China. I mean, the United States economy is larger, but just the sheer bulk, China's role as the major trading partner of so many countries in the world, no one matches that anymore. And so the only way that other countries in the world can hope to blunt Chinese influence, or can hope to somehow or other constrain Chinese behavior or encourage it to act as a citizen in ways that they would prefer, to get China to change what it does, is if they work together with other like-minded countries. Absent that, there is no hope. And so and that leads us to a world of a very balkanized world of individual countries working in their own interest, and that's going to be it will make it difficult to sustain the values and rules and institutions for which we've constructed over the last 60 or 70 years. So, Europe's choice boils down to working together, being effective as Europe, and working with the United States, Japan, Australia, and other like-minded countries to promote those same ideals and the same values.
Now, we need to be polite. It's late at night in Japan. So perhaps I may conclude with the final statement of Susanne Lichtmannecker, the head of our international relations. And she literally says, "Dear Brad, it's good to see you, so good to see you. Although it would have been much, much nicer to meet you face to face. Best wishes, Susanne." And I may add in, it has been a true pleasure to talk to you, to see you, to discuss it, to get the many insights. Thank you so much, Brad Glosserman. Best regards, have a good sleep, and the best regards to your family in Tokyo.
We will. Next time in MCI. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope so. I truly hope so. Now, let me just look into the future, into the near future. The next distinguished guests online and also face-to-face here on campus will be Robert Haltzman. He's the governor of the Central Bank of the Republic of Austria. And now we'll talk about monetary policy, current developments in monetary policy, and as a 0% interest or negative interest. That's one topic. Inflation is another topic which comes in. I think that will be a challenging topic. That will take place next Wednesday, the 17th of November at 5 p.m. Innsbruck time. It will be on campus. It will be in German, and will be most likely also live streamed. On Wednesday, the 24th of November, also at 5 p.m., also on campus, also in German, we will welcome an alumna being based in Berlin, Germany. And she's the Global Director of Public Relations of WOW Tech Group. They do the tech developments for the growth industry, sex business. And she lets us look behind the curtain, behind the scenes. And I think this is something really one could be interested, both gender or all different kinds of gender which are now around. And on Tuesday, the 30th of November, also on 5 p.m., also on campus, we will welcome Gerhard Berger, a earlier Formula One racer. He won several championships, and he is a very successful entrepreneur, and he will talk about a life in Formula One in life. So thank you so much for being with us. Enjoy you a good night, the rest of the night, and you here in Europe a nice rest of the evening. Thank you so much again.